Part 1 of this series of videos sought to demonstrate how minorities, despite possessing as a group less political, social or economic influence, are still more than capable of being racist towards individuals from the social majority. Whereas Part 2 tried to show how many of the claims made with regards to the existence of structural racism cannot be substantiated and are often the result of misreading of statistical evidence. Therefore, there still remains a few more things to be said in order to complete the refutation of the claim made by the Huffington Post that reverse racism is nothing more than a lie or a misnomer. This mainly concerns the illegitimacy of affirmative action policies which are used to try and redress the results of structural racism. As it is these policies that often spawn the accusation that the state has become actively racist against the majority ethnic group by unfairly benefiting minorities. Starting with theory, the most obvious issue is that if accusations of structural racism cannot be substantiated, then all proposals to redistribute resources or opportunities from one group to another lose their central justification. If inequalities between groups are not primarily the result of exploitation, then it becomes an immoral act of unfair discrimination for one group to be told that their economic achievements must be taken off of them in order to be given to another group to enforce an arbitrary state of equality between them. To demand such an equality of outcomes, where one does not already exist, requires the unequal treatment of both parties. And if this is interpreted in terms of racial groups, then this means a treatment that is racist by its very definition. Therefore, for reverse racism not to exist, there better be some very good evidence of structural racism at play, and not simply evidence of unequal outcomes when looked at from a bird's eye view. A second problem with redressing differences in outcomes between two groups of individuals is that it stops us from recognizing the important differences that also exist within those same groups. Even if we assume the existence of structural racism, it is unlikely that all members of one group being discriminated against will have suffered equally from such discrimination. It is hard to think that middle-class African Americans suffer from discrimination as much as those from poorer and working-class backgrounds. Taking the example of education, allowing African American students to enter university on a lower grade profile than white students will lead to the perverse outcome of working class or socially deprived white students being disadvantaged compared to middle class African Americans. By treating people in terms of their race, we radically diminish our ability to appreciate their other important characteristics. To add a bit of context, 32% of African American households earn over $50,000 per year, with just under 10% earning $100,000 or more. And the total size of the African American middle class grows closer to being 50% of the total if we take the definition of middle class to mean a family that earns over $35,000 per year. There are millions of white as well as Asian American households that earn less money than the African American middle class, yet they stand to be disadvantaged towards them as a consequence of affirmative action policies that judge people according to their racial group. A natural response to this might be to suggest a more complex system which indexes all forms of social disadvantage in order to avoid such unfair racial discrimination. But how on earth any accurate data is meant to be found with regards to the precise level of structural discrimination experienced by each individual student is anyone's guess, especially when a number of other factors mentioned in the previous video also have to be taken into account. If, for example, we recognise the presence of different attitudes towards learning as a factor that determines educational outcomes, as witnessed by the incredible number of hours spent on homework by Asian American students, how is the effect of this meant to be quantified so that it can be removed in order to isolate and reveal the true impact of racism on African American students? In his work comparing affirmative action programs tried in a number of different countries around the world, Thomas Sowell highlights how these concerns are also often further complicated by becoming politicized. Sowell notes that across a number of international settings, programs for affirmative action are invariably exploited by already advantaged members of the supposedly disadvantaged minority. This is not a surprise, as the middle classes are by their nature best organised to take advantage of such opportunities and often possess a strong sense of family aspiration. To take an example from the British context, The prevalence of middle-class parents sending their children to study at selective state grammar schools is a case in point. An institution that was originally designed to aid the social mobility of working-class pupils has become swamped by middle-class opportunism. Thomas Sowell has also noted that whenever affirmative action schemes are introduced, they often justify their discrimination on grounds of race by claiming to be only temporary measures which will be dismantled as soon as the problem of inequality has been eradicated. However, despite such promises, these schemes seldom ever prove to be temporary in nature, and like any other government programme, they put a lot of effort into securing their own self-preservation. As with all government handouts, they are very politically popular to introduce, but difficult when it comes to finally taking them away again. Though one cause of this is the fact that affirmative action programmes prove stubbornly incapable of achieving their desired outcomes. This is because they rarely target the underlying causes of underperformance, and instead simply try to move the goalposts. Policies of preferential employment on the basis of somebody's race rather than their competency inevitably leads to people being put into roles and positions of responsibility that they are not qualified to fill. Furthermore, this in turn can create cultures of resentment amongst those in the majority group who feel that they have unfairly lost out due to preferential treatment of minorities. Just as it can also cast a toxic shadow of suspicion over all members of a minority group, as they are unfairly suspected of only gaining their achievements as a result of racial preference. One final problem with narratives that uncritically support and assert the existence of structural racism is that they all too often give rise to a rather ugly populist culture of naming and shaming groups and individuals who might seek to divert from the received narrative, or those who are perceived as not being enthusiastic enough in their support. This was evidenced recently when Sajid Javid became the first ever British Chancellor of Asian origin. The son of a British Pakistani bus driver, Javid was labelled with the racist slur of being a coconut for supposedly having betrayed his race by being a member of the Conservative Party. Just as the Guardian newspaper saw fit to draw a cartoon of the British Home Secretary, Priti Patel, that depicted her, a woman of Hindu heritage, as an enraged cow. Although Islam doesn't fit the criteria of being a race, Majid Nawaz complains of often being called an Uncle Tom by members of his own community for calling out Islamic extremism. There are no doubt a myriad of examples in the American context of black and minority conservatives being branded as race traitors. Another wonderful example of this in action occurred in 2017, when the London School of Economics' review of books criticised the work of Thomas Sowell. The particular reviewer in question wrote that Sowell's criticisms of left-wing political ideals were all too easy for him to make as a rich white man. This enlightened form of criticism was shortly removed from the review when it was discovered by the LSE that Thomas Sowell is in fact an African American. The way in which Lewis Hamilton tried to publicly shame the Formula One establishment several days after the death of George Floyd for not sufficiently reacting to the event is another prime example of this mentality operating on a group level. Never mind the fact that an international racing car organisation might not be considered the most obvious or appropriate outfit for addressing police brutality in America. To remain silent was to be complicit in racism, even on an organisational level. As such, we can now see how rapidly the culture of accusation can spin out of control, and how everything very quickly becomes race-obsessed. Let us conclude by returning to the beginning, where this set of videos started. The claim made by the Huffington Post that reverse racism doesn't exist. We now know that this claim can be firmly refuted on 3 levels. Number 1, that reverse racism can occur on an individual level. Number 2, that claims of structural racism rest on a much more dubious foundation than we are often led to believe. Number 3, that policies as well as the cultural expectations created to try and solve these supposed problems of structural racism frequently generate their own form of unfair racist discrimination. As such, this argument is long due to be put out to pasture.